sometimes have unintended effects. In his case, it blew his finger off. In the case of parents leaving a gun around and little kids grabbing it, sometimes taking it to school, other times playing with their friends and inadvertently shooting them, that's happened in the United States. In other cases, people utilize guns in order to inflict injury on each other. So the Second Amendment right to bear arms is controversial because it has all of these effects. But why was it so important, and so important that right after expression, which is the First Amendment, was it put in the Constitution? It was put in the Constitution because, but for the fact that these guys had rifles on their mantle, we'd still have probably the Queen as the figurehead, like in Canada. Canada has a democratic government, but the Queen is still the Queen in Canada, it's still in the Bahamas, and so on. We would not have won a revolution against England. We probably would be speaking a very different type of English and have a different form of government today. We wouldn't be part of England because England ultimately let go most, if not all, of its colonies in peaceful methods. We were the only colony that actually revolted and had a revolution and kicked England out. England let go of all of its other colonies. But that's why that right is so important, because but for the fact that these guys had guns, they were able to wage an important revolution. But for the fact that they had guns, they had Washington. Why? Because if they didn't have guns, Washington wouldn't have had an army to be the general of. And therefore, Washington would not have been this revered figure in the United States. So the right to bear arms is such an important right. Okay? Quartering soldiers in the Third Amendment. Not that important today, but back then it was pretty important because the British brought their army and said, now where do we put these soldiers? They're here for the purpose of defending the Americans against the natives and against the French, those diabolic French people. They have the audacity of speaking French in the New World. What is that? I'm just joking about the speaking French. But the British saw the French as a real threat to the colonies. Why? Well, because they had just finished fighting a war called the French and Indian War. And many of the natives had been a threat to the colonists. Why? Because we took their land. So the British needed to have armed forces here and said, well, where are we going to put them up? We're going to put them up in your house. So colonists were required to quarter. Quarter is giving house to soldiers. And therefore, the colonists said, this is unfair. This is unfair to us that you bring in people that we don't know, you stick them in our house, and we're supposed to stand by that. So the Third Amendment is an amendment that says that the government cannot quarter soldiers in time of peace, and there has to be some sort of compensation if they ultimately resolve to do that in the time of war. In the time of war, nobody complains about having soldiers in your house, but in the time of peace, you do. Okay? Now, we get to the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendments. Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment of the Constitution really begin to talk about the rights that you have. Let me say that again. The rights that you have. Who has?
You.
Okay. Who?
Us.
Okay. The rights that you have if you're accused of a crime. And hopefully that will never happen to any one of you in this classroom. Let me say that again. I hope, I pray, I beg that none of you are ever in a situation where you're charged with a crime. But if you are,
We'll call you for your.
I will change my number. If you are, it's pretty good that there is a set or a bundle of rights that you are entitled to have in order to defend yourself. Okay? So if I was thinking about what it was, it's like a defense kit that you can bring out and say, okay, these are the rights that I have. How can I defend myself? Well, number one, the police can't search my stuff without
A
warrant, unless there's some expedient circumstance like, I've got a semi-automatic machine gun in my back seat and they stop me for a traffic a citation, he sees it there. Well, he doesn't need a warrant. He can just take the gun and arrest me. You think that this is a bad example, but a good friend of mine was a prosecutor. That means the person that charges on behalf of the government, and she was in juvenile. She prosecuted juveniles accused of crimes. In one of her cases, a juvenile was stopped by a police officer, and he had an Uzi in the back seat. The officer, an Uzi is a semi-automatic machine gun. So the officer stops him to give him a speeding ticket. He looks in the car, and there sitting there is a semi-automatic machine gun, which, by the way, is illegal. So obviously he arrests the kid for having possession of the firearm and so on. So there are some expedient circumstances under which the government doesn't need a warrant to search you, but generally it does. The rule is that the government must conduct reasonable searches, and reasonable searches are generally with a warrant. That's the Fourth Amendment. It's an observation that you have a right to your privacy. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court has said that all of you have a right to be secure in those places that you feel that you have privacy. Now, if you're having a conversation in an elevator that's full of people, and you say to your friend, listen, I'm thinking of killing Chum Chum as soon as this elevator stops. Yeah. Well, the government can record that without a warrant because you didn't have an expectation of privacy in a busy elevator. But if you're in your room and you're saying it to somebody else, and the somebody else doesn't give authority to the police to record you, and you don't give authority, the government needs to have some sort of warrant to wiretap. Listen, as soon as we get out of this room, I'm going to kill Chum Chum. Okay? If not, and they do, then that statement can't be used against me with regards to killing Chum Chum. Sorry, Chum, you're dead at the end of this either way. I know that you're okay with that because you're a good chum.
So if let's say like the cops or whatever, like they give kill someone, so they can check.
Well, if the police feel that you are going to have conversations that are ultimately conversations that lead to a crime, they can go to a judge, convince the judge that they have something called probable cause, reason to believe that you're engaged in conversations about a crime. And the judge will issue an order, which is called a warrant, and they will be able to bug your phone and listen to your conversation. But without that warrant, they can't. Okay? They can't. Generally, they can't. There are these new laws called the Patriot Act that kind of make that fuzzy, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Okay? We're not going to worry about that right now. So the Fourth Amendment gives people a right to privacy in their stuff, in their person, okay? In their stuff, in their person, so that you can live your life without the government interfering. And it isn't so much, think about it, it isn't so much the right that's given to criminals. Because if I said, well, the police shouldn't see this drug dealer, they shouldn't be able to, but all of us would say, he's a drug dealer, this police should be able to do it. The problem is that oftentimes the police don't necessarily know that it's a drug dealer, so they wiretap, they record conversations of people who are not. Of your conversation with somebody, that it's a private conversation. Your photographs, your text, your emails with somebody that you want to keep private. And therefore, that protection is very necessary to us. Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is an amendment that's extremely popular. Number one, it's my favorite number 5.
Why?
I don't know. Well, because I was born on the 5th month on the 25th day. So 5 is an important one. My oldest son was born on the 5th day of the month, and my oldest child was born on the 25th day of the month. So 5 is a pretty important number to me, but the Fifth Amendment is probably one of the most popular because generally, people that don't know the law, when they're asked a question, they know that they're going to have to tell on themselves. I plead the Fifth. It generally says, I did it. The Fifth Amendment, the right that is most recognizable in it is that we have a right not to tell on ourselves. The government can't force us to tell on ourselves. Okay? And that's the right that you all know about when a police officer stops you and is going to arrest you and he says you have the right to remain Silent, very good. You have the right to remain silent. That comes out of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, yes.
Can you say that? Then how come
What? The rights, as soon as I answer
how come
the next
in
question.
the interrogation they're like, why'd you kill him? Did you kill him?
Because what they do is that they read those rights, and if the person doesn't say, I'm going to remain silent, they can still talk to you. And as long as they read you your rights, they can talk to you.
Oh, okay.
Okay? But if they say you have the right to remain silent, and you say, I'm not going to talk to you, they can no longer talk to you because you've exercised your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The rights are you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one shall be provided for you. You understand these rights. Okay, that's the rights that are given to anybody that is arrested or going to be arrested for a crime. Now, the Fifth Amendment has a couple of other rights in it that are not as well known, but are just as important. Number one, the Fifth Amendment has a right against double jeopardy. And there was a movie a couple of years ago, which was a very popular movie, and every time I talked about the Fifth Amendment right against double jeopardy, people would ask me about it. And let me tell you what the theme of the movie was. It was pretty cool. This woman had gotten married with this man, and they had a child together, and apparently the relationship had soured. He was having an affair. You know the dramas that get on TV. So it actually wasn't TV, it was in the movies. And what he did is he apparently was involved in crimes. He wanted to make himself disappear. So they went on a yacht. He apparently owed a lot of money to a lot of people. She was not necessarily aware of it. And in the yacht, he drugs her.
Who, the wife or
He drugs the wife. So she wakes up the next morning and there is blood all over the yacht. She's the only one on the yacht at the time. And there is some weapon that incriminates her. So obviously they find the yacht. She says, I didn't do it, but she doesn't remember what happened the night. So they try her and they convict her for the murder of her husband because even though they did not find his body, there was enough blood where they said, you know, nobody could have survived this. Okay? She's in jail. They're moving her. She's able to, well, she keeps in contact with her best friend, who ultimately is taking care of her child. Over some period of time, the best friend disappears. And her contact with her child disappears. And she's very stressed because the most important thing in her life is her child. So they're moving her from one place to another, and she manages to escape. And then she begins the investigation to try to find out where's her son. In her investigation to find out where her son is, she tracks him down with the father and with her best friend, who's now the new wife. Now, she's already been convicted for the murder of her husband, the guy that's here. So she says, hey, they can't convict me again for killing you because I've already been convicted. That's double jeopardy. So I'm going to kill you. That's Hollywood. That doesn't really happen. But what double jeopardy really means is this. If you are tried, if you're accused of a crime, and you're taken to trial, and a jury finds you not guilty, you can never again be tried for that crime, even if you say, I did it. Let me say that again. If you are found not guilty, you can come out the next day and say, I did it, and the government can't try you. That's why oftentimes the government doesn't charge people even if they believe that you committed a crime, unless they have enough evidence to be able to prove it to a jury.
Is that what happened to your person? That when like he said like, that when the case was closed, that you went next day and like, I did it, guys.
what do you say?
The lower thing, whatever.
If somebody is found not guilty and says I did it, they cannot be tried again for that particular crime. Exactly.
No.
Okay, come.
No, I always have to be so.
Double jeopardy.
Sounds
Oh,
good,
you were
right?
talking about
It's a
this?
pretty good movie.